It me, your little mushroom lady, coming at you with content. This week, I had no commissions, no volunteering to watch children, and no stressful job interviews. Instead, I was blessed with art block and a broken hot water heater. But after severe lengths of procrastinating and also boiling water on the stove so I wouldn't have to dunk my head in frigid waters, I finally decided to sit down and push through it. And boy am I glad I did! I usually find out that after a big span of art block and concern about my value in the world as an artist, I create some of the pieces I am most proud of. This drawing was no exception. Usually, I'm extremely nervous about sketching while recording. I'm always nervous about having the perfect sketch the first time, which realistically isn't something I should be pressured about, but it still gets to me. Even though I had my hesitations this time, I knew what I was going for from the get-go and busted out a really simple but really elegant pose for the character. This character is Solanum Dolramund, who has some interesting beginnings. Back in 2018, I think, just before or as I was getting into D&D and Critical Role, I was listening to the podcast We're Alive by Casey Wayland, a zombie post-apocalyptic audio drama that apparently has a sequel that was put out this year. At the time of listening, I was doing inventory of the chemicals that were around the science complex. There's nothing like zombie noises as background ambience to walking around in the dark hallways of a university that has been vacated for the summer. Needless to say, the podcast got my storytelling gears turning and the good brain juices flowing. I wanted to create something that was a cross between the Fallen of Malazan book series and We're Alive, and had full intentions to create and voice with my sisters and friends a full fantasy podcast. I had a magic system, we had characters, locations, an overarching plot, but I was never able to get it beyond the brainstorming point for a couple of reasons. Solanum was going to be my half-orc character, a cleric who also knew how to pack a punch, and by pack a punch, I mean wield a great axe. She was strong, scary, and had a thick braid with the sides of her head shaved, and thighs that could crush skulls. Solanum is still a half-orc, but instead of carrying a greatsword, she is now one of the 8 people who jointly govern a city called Basilia. Basilia values knowledge and meticulous record-keeping and is well known for its many well-stocked libraries. Now I know her look gives off strong monk vibes, however, I already have a really cool monk NPC in my back pocket for the campaign, so I was thinking of maybe a fighter class or a wizard, since she's surrounded by books. For pants, I first thought to put on shorts and have sort of these big ballooning trousers with cutouts to make it edgier, because life is about fulfilling your edgy artist teenage dreams once you have the appropriate set of art skills to do so. But maybe not for this drawing. I ended up scrapping that idea because I felt like the pants were, first of all, too casual, and then second of all, created an unbalanced, very bottom-heavy figure. I had given Solanum a still athletic, but more dexterous figure, leaving out the watermelon-crushing thighs in exchange for a much more lithe look. I didn't want all the excess fabric to bunch around her ankles in the character design, and on top of this, knowing that I eventually wanted to add a robe-like feature, meant that I had to consider how all that extra fabric would drape and look together. In the end, I decided to prioritize making her clothing with movement in mind. That is, making the materials look fairly lightweight and reducing any bulk that would end up around her feet. Now, styling clothes is not my strongest suit at all, but I knew I wanted several things. I wanted lots of different ties around the waist, I wanted clothing that would allow a lot of mobility, but I also wanted to throw in something like a robe because a robe as opposed to a cloak just kind of feels academic, I don't know. I know in most of my videos you see me do one red sketch and call that good. But oftentimes, I will do a second, more detailed sketch layer in this bright blue to help with the details on top of a form that I don't want to erase by accident. I gave Solanum the sort of hooked Greek/Roman nose shape because, I mean, for one, does it not look amazing? And for two, Basilia, the city that she's from, in appearance is very heavily inspired by Greek and Roman architecture. Think domes, arches, and so many pillars. I wanted to make this NPC, who is very near and dear to my heart, reflect that quite strongly. The floral design I'm putting on her shoulder arm sleeve thing was actually going to be a stand-in design. I was going to replace it with a more detailed design or a symbol of the governing group that she's a part of, but I ended up liking it so much that it stayed throughout the final render of the clothing. I really love how the sketch turned out, but I wanted to keep the sort of painty style that I did for Madrive relatively consistent throughout my campaign book. I think this drawing would have looked absolutely amazing in my line art style. Her outfit and appearance are just so crisp, and it makes me happy. And it really terrified me to work on painting it just because I didn't want to lose details or the sharpness that was in the original sketch. And I actually saved a copy of the sketch just in case I felt like going in and doing a line art style later. Also this time I remembered to duplicate the sketch layer so I can reference it later. And you might also notice that I keep the robe detail on a completely separate layer. This is so I can draw all the details in very carefully and then realize that I cover them all up with fabric later. I'm joking. Well, half joking. You'll see what I mean later. While I'm working on coloring for the drawing, if you don't mind, I'm going to talk a little bit about my world building process because a couple people have been curious about how my book is coming along, or how much I prepare for campaigns or sessions, and how do I get over not being able to explain everything, sort of questions like that. And I've said this once, I'll say it again, I'm not a D&D expert. I'm in fact a very new DM. I've done a fair amount of world building, characters design, and other things, but by no means is my creative process a guarantee to work for everyone else. Let's be honest, I've never published a book, never created a campaign as big as the one I'm working on now, and am hardly qualified to be giving any sort of cure-all advice for new world builders, but what I am more or less of an expert on is my own creative process, what works for me, and what gives me, a person with the anxious need to over-prepare, peace of mind before sharing my world with others. To answer the question of how the campaign book is going, hard to say. My honest feelings about it are that it's all very bad. I'm not making as much progress as I would like, but trying to step out of my own feelings, I really do have a lot figured out. As of right now, I have a solidified pantheon, a continent map, art of 2 really significant NPCs and 1 significant location. I have a brief description for most of the different major cities and regions in Vassadal, the continent, and I even have descriptions of key NPCs that my party might meet along the way. There's an overarching major conflict, and though it not be written down, I have little leveling dungeons and side quests for the party to encounter and uncover. Now you might say, hey lady, that's a lot. What do you mean you're not ready to run the campaign? Well, this is where the anxiety comes in. Let me contrast the 2 games I'm currently running. The first D&D game I started was a one-shot that got expanded into a mini-campaign because at the time I was quite bad at estimating how much is able to be covered in a single session. It was designed as a sort of level 3, level 4 character quest to expose 2 people who had never played D&D before to the environment's basic mechanics, simple spellcasting, and combat. I had to design 2 or 3 towns, fill them with my own NPCs, and have a small boss battle design, among other things. The other campaign I'm actively running is Curse of Strahd, a much beloved and fleshed out, more or less pre-built campaign. If you ask me which one I would rather run a next session for on the spot, I would pick my own work, Baron's Blight. Not because it's better, far from it, but because at least in my own campaign, I know exactly what I do and don't have answers for. I know the secrets, I understand everything clearly. Of course, this is mostly on me for agreeing to start Curse of Strahd before I felt I had the time to fully grasp the entirety of the campaign, but this really is the answer to how much do I prepare for a campaign. You always hear things like, don't over-prepare, because truly there's no amount of preparation that can be done to predict what D&D players are going to do. But the key is to prepare enough to make yourself feel comfortable in the sandbox that you have made for your players. That no matter what they do, what spells are cast, what goats are bought, and even if they try to step outside of the sandbox, you have something ready for them. Or that you know enough about the environment to provide meaningful consequences, good or bad, to the session. For some people, this is simply having an idea, a rough map, and a few willing participants. For me, it's extreme levels of note-taking, many Google Doc files, and more often than you might think, a bank of names that you can pull out for NPCs that you might make on the spot. This may not be a very straightforward or satisfying answer, but it's pretty hard to give you a number for what amount of information and prep makes you feel comfortable leading out the setting. The takeaway here is that you should be comfortable enough with your environment that you can be flexible, but also not come up empty-handed. Your players need little strings to grab on in order to take action. You should have enough there so your players have something like a next task, more or less, available to them, while also being flexible enough to not have a breakdown when your players decide to learn to crochet with the strings that you have given them instead of pull on them. So how do you prep for a single session? For me, prepping for a session is usually 1 to 2.5 pages of bullet notes of paths that they could take. For session 1 of both Baron's Blight, my mini campaign, and Curse of Strahd, I started with a setting description and gave them NPCs close by to interact with. From this point onward, planning went very differently for each party. The Curse of Strahd party, very story-oriented, grabbed the strings and pulled, and ran with whatever I handed them. The Baron's Blight party, not so much. They're a lot more interested in exploring the town and marketplace than I anticipated, so the bullet notes for Curse of Strahd are much more step-by-step path-oriented, whereas Baron's Blight is a lot more if-then statements and notes about the consequences of waiting in the town instead of going immediately to investigate the murder scene and hunting down the killer. In the end, your prep is going to look a little different depending on your players, but in general, in my notes, I like to always start the session with a recap to remind players where they were, and then give them something to get the ball rolling, whether it's a strange new stall in the local marketplace, or mournful crying echoing through the silent streets. Then I try to note a few encounters. If the encounter is a battle, that's going to take up a bigger chunk of your game, and you're going to prepare a lot fewer encounters. If it's speaking with an NPC, make notes of what the NPC knows or can contribute to the adventure, whether it's a side quest or it's key information to the overarching plot. If the encounter is something like travel or an escape sequence, I like to have a few DCs for acrobatics or strength checks that I can predict, set up and ready to go. Lastly, if you're not ready to keep going, it's not bad to cut off the session. While I don't recommend having exclusively extremely short sessions with very little progress, in my experience as a player and a DM, having the DM be honest about not being ready rather than making a session equivalent to an anime filler episode is much preferred. Lastly, how do I not be anxious about not having every last detail figured out? This can be a very relevant question when coming up with anatomy for a monster, a historical timeline, or perhaps even a complex magic system. If you're at your wit's end about research for your story and you just can't come up with a solution no matter how much you sleep on it, the advice that comforts me the most is weirdly also one that is kind of unsettling in day-to-day life. The human brain likes to extract information and make sense of it, whether or not it makes sense. In a lighthearted example, think of the grill and headlights of a car, and how some people put eyelashes or reindeer antlers and noses on the vehicle because you look at it and you can see a face. In a less lighthearted example, think about that dark pile of clothing on the chair across the room in the middle of the night that kind of looks like a stalker staring at you. Either way, your brain is trying to accommodate for lack of information and fill that with perceived information. You can often leave something only briefly discussed, and a lot of other people will do the brain work for you in understanding the logic. Another thing to remember is that not everyone knows or can explain everything. When I got my hair styled professionally for the first time for my wedding, my stylist talked about how professors of science and engineering would come to get their hair done for big conferences and events, and a lot of them who work on world-changing research were absolutely boggled by how easily and quickly she was able to look at a picture and then recreate the style or manipulate their hair to match the image. And the same can be said of me. I'm a pretty decent cook, I can sew, I'm an artist, I've graduated with an engineering degree, and yet I know nothing about history. And it's not like I ever did bad in a history class. In fact, I always thought history was super interesting, but almost none of it has stuck with me. And that's just life, baby. Maybe your NPC is just bad at history like me, or maybe your main character isn't a biologist who needs to know the anatomy of every creature they find. Not to abruptly stop the conversation, but here's where I bring back the rogue sketch. The reason I saved it for last is because I wanted the fabric to be light and sheer. I build up the color by gradually adding other layers with like 30% opacity to imitate the look of sheer fabric folding over each other. This took a bit of messing around with to get right, but I think it doesn't look so bad, and I was able to keep all the cool little details like her tattooed arm and the belt around her waist still visible despite having the robe element that I wanted. Now, I don't have enough drawing time to keep droning on about my experiences in world building, and maybe someday if I get enough questions, I can do like a Ginny D style video that isn't a speed draw, or maybe is a speed draw, but also has a more organized format and like bulleted lists of information that are easy to follow, and isn't just me rambling with vague answers about my personal world building methods. But here Solanum is in all her glory. Before I close the video, I of course wanted to say thank you for all your support. It means the world to me, and I love being able to share my campaign building process with you, but I also wanted to say that whatever world building adventure you're on, I wish you all the best. I'm here for you if you want to leave comments or DM me on one of my social media platforms, but most of all, I believe in you. You can do it. Take the time you need, whether that's a few hours to get sorted or a few years to get in a better position time-wise or financially. No one else is going to make your art or your book or your campaign for you, and I believe you have exactly what it takes. I hope that inspires you to keep at it, or maybe I just sound super corny and you don't need no little mushroom lady on the internet telling you how to go about campaign building. But who knows? Not me.